The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council stretched nearly a kilometer in diameter, its curved walls displaying the homeworlds of all member species in slow rotation. 12,000 representatives from across the spiral arm filled the ascending tiers, their translation devices murmuring in countless languages. At the chamber's heart, suspended in a gravity-neutral field, floated the Council's military committee, 47 species who had proven themselves in conflicts spanning millennia. High Commander Sebastian occupied the Vordrani delegation's position with the peculiar stillness of a hive mind at rest. His physical form appeared humanoid at first glance, but the surface of his silver-blue skin rippled with barely perceptible patterns, the visible manifestation of a billion consciousnesses thinking in perfect unison. Behind him, 300 Vordrani drones stood in mathematically precise formation, their bodies swaying in synchronized rhythm like grass in an invisible wind. They breathed together, blinked together, existed as fingers on the same vast hand. The current petition under review scrolled across holographic displays in every delegate's native script. Earth's request for defensive sovereignty. Sebastian allowed his billion selves, a moment of what might have been amusement in a species capable of individual emotion. The human petition is denied. His voice emerged not from his throat alone, but from every Vordrani present, creating a chorus that spoke in perfect unison. The effect was mesmerizing, terrifying, absolute. Furthermore, the military committee votes to place Earth under Vordrani protective administration, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Sebastian felt the collective attention of the council focus on him, and he expanded his consciousness to address them all simultaneously. His drones gestured in unison, creating a choreographed display that would have required months of practice for any other species, but came as naturally to the Vordrani as breathing. The human species represents a unique case in council history, Sebastian continued, his billion minds speaking through 300 mouths. Our analysis spans their entire recorded existence, 10,000 years of constant internecine warfare, civil conflicts, religious schisms, wars fought over resources, ideology, territory. They have proven themselves utterly incapable of unifying even their own species under a coherent governing structure. A Trilaxian representative, their crystalline form refracting light in thoughtful patterns, pulsed a question. Sebastian didn't need their translation device to understand. The Vordrani had absorbed the linguistic patterns of every council species into their collective consciousness decades ago. You ask about their military capacity, Sebastian responded, his 300 bodies turning in perfect synchronization to face the Trilaxian delegation. We have observed their armed forces extensively. Each vessel operates under the command of a single biological entity, a captain who makes decisions in isolation. Their fleet actions require constant communication, negotiation, debate between these individual commanders. In the time it takes them to coordinate a simple formation change, a proper collective consciousness can execute 17 tactical adaptations. Sebastian paused, allowing his consciousness to ripple through his drones in a wave pattern that the council had learned to recognize as emphasis. They command their warships through disagreement. Their military doctrine incorporates something they call independent thinking, as if warfare could be improved by ensuring every soldier operates from a different understanding of tactical reality. It is, essentially, a cognitive defect scaled to the military level. The Genkari Observer, a species that had fought alongside the Vordrani in the Third Expansion War, whistled their agreement through specialized breathing chambers. The Vordrani assessment is sound. Humanity's individualism is an evolutionary dead end in modern warfare. They are children playing with weapons they cannot hope to coordinate effectively. Sebastian felt the vote before it was cast. The collective consciousness that connected every Vordrani across 100 star systems could sense probability waves, could feel the weight of inevitable decisions. The 47 species of the military committee would vote unanimously for Earth's subjugation. They would do so because they had seen the data, understood the analysis, recognized the fundamental truth that Sebastian's billion minds knew with absolute certainty. Warfare in the age of faster-than-light travel and planet-killing weapons required the kind of coordination that only a hive mind could achieve. "We propose a 6-rotation compliance period," Sebastian announced, his voices harmonizing in perfect fourths. "The Vordrani fleet will escort human vessels to designated protection zones. Their military infrastructure will be integrated into our defensive network. They will, for the first time in their existence, know the peace that comes from proper unity." What Sebastian perceived as peace, his billion minds understood with crystalline clarity, was the absence of individual choice. The Vordrani had evolved past the primitive stage of consciousness that wasted neural capacity on concepts like personal preference or independent thought. Every Vordrani mind contributed to the greater whole, every thought optimized for collective efficiency. They didn't suppress individuality, they had transcended it entirely, the way humans had transcended their evolutionary ancestors' need to walk on all fours. Looking at humanity's petition, at the desperate arguments about sovereignty and self-determination, Sebastian felt something that might have been pity if his species still experienced emotions individually. These humans actually believed their fragmented consciousness was strength. They actually thought that having every soldier make separate decisions was superior to having a billion minds calculate optimal outcomes in microseconds. It was like watching children insist that counting on their fingers was superior to quantum computation. The vote proceeded exactly as Sebastian's predictive algorithms had calculated. 47 species, unanimous. Earth would be brought into compliance within 6 planetary rotations. In Sebastian's distributed consciousness, this outcome wasn't victory. It was simply the inevitable result of superior cognitive architecture. The humans would resist, of course. Fragmented minds always did, clinging to their illusion of independence. But resistance without coordination was merely chaos. And chaos, as the Vordrani had proven across 1,000 campaigns, always yielded to perfect order. Across the council chamber, unnoticed by Sebastian's vast awareness, Ambassador Wells stood from her seat in the human delegation. Her hands were steady, but every muscle in her body screamed with tension. She had known this vote was coming. Her intelligence analysts had predicted it with 97% certainty. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. Ambassador Sarah Wells had spent 23 years in the diplomatic corps, representing humanity to species that had been traveling between stars when Earth was still figuring out agriculture. She'd negotiated trade agreements with the methane-breathing Vexali, mediated territorial disputes between the Joran Empire and the Selenari Commonwealth, and once spent 6 months convincing a crystalline hive entity that humans weren't just unusually organized bacteria. She understood alien psychology, could navigate cultural differences that would drive most diplomats to madness. But the Vordrani were different. They weren't alien in the sense of having different customs or values. They were alien in the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself. Talking to Sebastian was like arguing with a storm or negotiating with gravity. His billion minds had already calculated every possible response she could give, had analyzed every tactical and strategic option, had determined with mathematical certainty that humanity's individualism was a weakness to be corrected. She activated her translation device and felt it warm against her throat. The chamber's acoustics carried her voice to every delegation, even though she knew the vote was already decided. Protocol demanded she speak anyway. Hope demanded it. Humanity demanded it. High Commander Sebastian. Wells's voice didn't echo through 300 synchronized drones, but it carried weight nonetheless. The weight of 10 billion individual voices that had chosen her to speak for them. Your hive mind has never faced an enemy where every single soldier thinks, adapts, and makes decisions independently in real time. We're not asking for your approval of our cognitive structure. We're asking you, begging you, not to mistake our diversity for weakness. Sebastian's 300 bodies turned toward her in perfect unison, and Wells felt the full weight of a billion minds focusing their attention on her singular consciousness. It was like standing in the beam of a star-sized spotlight, feeling the heat of a unified awareness so vast it could contemplate entire civilizations in the time it took her to form a single thought. Ambassador Wells. The harmonized voices filled the chamber with crystalline precision. We have analyzed 10,000 years of human history. Your wars against yourselves, your inability to unify even your own species under coherent governance, your ships commanded by individuals who must communicate through primitive verbal exchange instead of instant consciousness, sharing. You will be brought into compliance within 6 planetary rotations. This discussion is concluded. The weight of a billion minds lifted from her, and Wells felt suddenly small, singular, desperately alone. But that aloneness was what Sebastian would never understand. It was also what made her dangerous. Around her, the 47 species of the military committee registered their votes in various formats: holographic confirmations, crystalline resonances, bioluminescent pulses, quantum state collapses, every single one agreeing with Sebastian's assessment. Every single one dismissing humanity's warning as the desperate pleading of an inferior cognitive architecture. Wells's security detail, a mix of career diplomats and carefully disguised military intelligence officers, closed ranks around her as the council session adjourned. Commander James Rodriguez, officially her chief of staff but actually her tactical liaison to the United Earth Defense Fleet, leaned close enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond her translation device's range. We have 48 hours before their fleet reaches Earth, he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the implications. Admiral Okonkwo wants confirmation of rules of engagement. Wells looked back at Sebastian's delegation, watching the Vordrani file out in perfect synchronized formation, each drone moving in mathematical relation to the others, beautiful in a way, terrifying in every other way. A consciousness so vast it could coordinate fleets across light years, make decisions in microseconds, process tactical data that would overwhelm any individual mind. And they had absolutely no idea what they were actually up against. Tell the Admiral, Wells said quietly, that we tried to warn them. What happens next is on the Council's head, not ours. She felt the weight of that decision in her singular, isolated, uniquely human consciousness, the terrible responsibility of choices made by one mind instead of a billion. Rules of engagement are weapons-free the moment they cross the defense perimeter. And James? Tell her to show them exactly why we're still alive after 10,000 years of fighting each other. Rodriguez nodded and slipped away through the dispersing delegations, just another human in a galaxy that had just voted to end human independence. Wells remained in the great chamber as it slowly emptied, looking up at the rotating display of member worlds. Earth turned in the display, blue and white, and heartbreakingly fragile. 48 hours until the Vordrani fleet arrived. 48 hours until Sebastian learned that perfect unity had one catastrophic weakness. It had never learned to fight chaos that fought back. The Vordrani Armada materialized at the edge of Earth's solar system in a display that would have made gods weep with envy. 12,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit in mathematically perfect formation, their hulls reflecting Sol's light in synchronized patterns. Each vessel occupied its designated coordinates with precision measured in nanometers, creating a geometric lattice that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. The formation itself was a weapon, a demonstration of the kind of coordination that only a unified consciousness could achieve. High Commander Sebastian existed simultaneously aboard every ship in the fleet. His billion minds stretched across the Armada like neurons in a vast brain, each vessel a cell in a greater organism. He could feel the power cores humming in perfect resonance, the weapon systems charging in synchronized cycles, the shield generators creating overlapping fields that turned 12,000 individual ships into a single, impenetrable fortress. This was what warfare looked like when practiced by a proper civilization. Not the chaotic scrambling of isolated minds, but the elegant precision of unity. Through a million sensors, Sebastian observed the human defense fleet waiting near Mars' orbit. 800 vessels, their formation so loose it barely qualified as military organization. Human ships scattered across a volume of space that the Vordrani would have occupied with 10 times the efficiency. No synchronized positioning, no unified energy signatures, each vessel broadcasting its own identification codes, operating its own isolated systems, commanded by individual biological entities making separate decisions. It was almost sad, Sebastian thought through his billion minds. Like watching children arrange toys and calling it strategy. He opened communication channels across every frequency the humans used, his voice emerging from 12,000 ships simultaneously. Attention, Earth Defense Fleet. You are ordered to power down your weapon systems and prepare for escort to designated compliance zones. Resistance is futile. You are facing a consciousness that coordinates 12,000 warships as easily as you control your individual bodies. Stand down, and this transition will be peaceful. The human response came from a single source. One ship, one voice, one isolated mind trying to speak for a whole species. Admiral Okonkwo, according to Sebastian's intelligence analysis, commander of Earth's combined fleet, a military career spanning 42 years, psychological profile indicating stubbornness and tactical creativity. All irrelevant statistics when facing a hive mind that could calculate 1 million tactical variations in the time it took her to form a single thought. Commander Sebastian, Okonkwo's voice carried across the void, and Sebastian noted the way she emphasized his singular designation, as if he were merely one entity instead of a billion. You were warned. We're going to give you one more chance to withdraw. What you're seeing isn't our defense fleet. It's our welcoming committee. Sebastian felt the electromagnetic equivalent of amusement ripple through his distributed consciousness. The humans were bluffing, obviously. His tactical analysis had mapped every military installation in the Sol system, tracked every ship, calculated the precise combat capacity of Earth's defense forces. They had 800 vessels of varying classes, crews totaling approximately 400,000 individuals, weapon systems ranging from kinetic projectiles to directed energy arrays. All impressive for a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 generations ago. All utterly inadequate against a consciousness that had been waging war since before humanity discovered fire. "Your warning is noted and dismissed, Admiral," Sebastian responded through his fleet. "You have 60 seconds to begin powering down your weapons, or we will initiate forced compliance protocols." The human fleet didn't power down. They didn't scatter in panic. They simply waited. 800 ships spread across millions of kilometers like seeds scattered on water, and Sebastian's billion minds began calculating the most efficient approach vectors. The Vordrani initiation of engagement was a thing of terrible beauty. The fleet moved as one organism, executing a standard envelopment pattern that had overwhelmed 47 species across 3 centuries of Council peacekeeping operations. The outer wings of Sebastian's formation curved inward in perfect arcs, surrounding the human fleet in a sphere of overlapping firing solutions. Every ship knew its exact position relative to every other ship. Every weapon system locked onto predetermined targets with microsecond precision. Every shield generator adjusted its frequency to create a unified defensive field. The envelopment should have trapped the humans in a kill zone where 12,000 ships could deliver simultaneous fire from every angle. It was mathematically elegant, tactically flawless, and had never failed against any opponent the Vordrani had faced. That's when the humans stopped waiting and started moving. Sebastian's billion minds processed the data in parallel, and for the first time in his existence, he experienced something that a fragmented consciousness might have called confusion. The human ships didn't attempt formation maneuvers. They didn't coordinate movement patterns. They just moved, each vessel choosing its own vector, its own acceleration, its own tactical approach, with no visible connection to the actions of any other ship. It was chaos. Pure, undisciplined, utterly unpredictable chaos. And it was working. A human destroyer designated Contact 247 in Sebastian's tactical overlay suddenly burned at maximum acceleration toward the nearest Vordrani cruiser, then cut its engines entirely and went ballistic while rotating to present its heaviest armor. The Vordrani cruiser's targeting solution had calculated intercept vectors based on continued acceleration. By the time Sebastian's consciousness updated the tactical model across his fleet, Contact 247 had already passed through the engagement zone and was firing on a different target entirely. Multiply that by 800 ships, each making independent decisions, each responding to threats with individual tactical judgment, and Sebastian's unified tactical consciousness found itself trying to track 800 separate probability clouds instead of one coherent enemy formation. Worse, the humans started communicating on open channels. Not coordinated tactical data, but individual observations, suggestions, even arguments between ship commanders. Sebastian monitored the chatter with growing incomprehension. "Rodriguez, you've got 3 bandits on your 6. Recommend you break left and I'll swing around for crossfire." "Negative, Foster. Break right yourself and draw them into my missile envelope. Trust me." "Your missile envelope? Last time I trusted your missile envelope, I nearly lost my whole port battery." "That was one time. Are you going to hold that against me forever?" "Until you admit it was a bad call, yeah." They were bickering in the middle of combat, while making tactical decisions that somehow resulted in coordinated crossfire that caught 3 of Sebastian's destroyers in overlapping fields of fire. Sebastian's billion minds recoiled from the impossibility of it. How could they coordinate without coordination? How could individual decisions create emergent tactical patterns? It was like watching random quantum fluctuations somehow spell out poetry. The Vordrani fleet adapted, of course. That's what a unified consciousness did. Identify the pattern, adjust tactics, overwhelm through superior coordination. Sebastian analyzed the human combat data, processed their movement algorithms, calculated predictive models for individual ship behavior. His fleet began targeting human vessels that showed the most erratic behavior, eliminating the sources of chaos to force the enemy into more predictable responses. Then, the humans changed tactics entirely. Ships that had been engaging at medium range suddenly burned toward the Vordrani fleet at maximum acceleration, closing to point-blank distances where Sebastian's careful formations became a liability. Human vessels threading through gaps in the Vordrani sphere, firing at targets of opportunity, breaking away before his unified tactical response could lock weapons. They were fighting like a swarm of insects, like a school of fish, like 800 completely independent entities that somehow avoided colliding with each other while creating maximum disruption in the Vordrani formation. Sebastian tried to compensate by tightening his fleet's formation, reducing the gaps the humans were exploiting. Immediately, 3 human cruisers broke away from the main engagement and began broadcasting what his analysis identified as electronic warfare signals, jamming frequencies, false targeting data, electromagnetic chaff that interfered with Vordrani ship-to-ship coordination. His billion minds processed the threat and adapted, shifting to backup communication protocols. But the humans had already moved on to different tactics. Kinetic projectiles fired not at ships but at empty space where Sebastian's predictive algorithms calculated his fleet would be in 30 seconds. They were shooting where his ships were going to be, not where they were, and doing it through individual tactical judgment rather than computational prediction. When Sebastian adjusted his fleet's movement patterns to avoid the kinetic bombardment, the humans shifted back to directed energy weapons, firing from angles that exploited the gaps his formation changes had created. It was impossible. They were reacting faster than his unified consciousness could adapt, and they were doing it through individual decisions made by isolated biological entities with reaction times measured in hundreds of milliseconds. It violated every principle of modern warfare, every tactical doctrine Sebastian's billion minds had developed over centuries of conflict. Unless... The thought crystallized across Sebastian's distributed consciousness with the cold shock of revelation. The humans weren't reacting faster. They were reacting differently. 800 independent tactical minds making 800 separate decisions, and while any individual decision might be suboptimal, the sheer unpredictability created an enemy that couldn't be modeled, couldn't be predicted, couldn't be countered through unified tactical adaptation. Because every time Sebastian's billion minds identified a pattern in human behavior, 800 individual humans were already trying something different. Through his sensors aboard the dreadnought that served as his primary command nexus, Sebastian watched as a human corvette, a single small vessel that should have been irrelevant in a fleet engagement, executed a maneuver so reckless that his tactical algorithms had assigned it 0 probability of success. The corvette burned directly at a Vordrani battlecruiser, absorbing fire that should have vaporized it, rolling at the last microsecond to present its heavily damaged port side, while its intact starboard weapons opened fire at point-blank range. The battlecruiser's shields, calibrated for long-range engagement, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the sudden shift in firing angle. The human corvette's weapons punched through, crippling the larger vessel's primary drive system. The corvette didn't survive. Its already damaged hull finally gave way under the battlecruiser's defensive fire, but in the seconds before it died, its pilot transmitted on open channels. "Rodriguez here. That's how you use a missile envelope, Foster." Another human voice, presumably this Foster, responded with something Sebastian's linguistic analysis identified as laughter mixed with profanity and grief. "You magnificent bastard. Rest easy, Rodriguez, I've got your section." They were mourning and fighting simultaneously. processing individual loss while maintaining combat effectiveness, experiencing emotions that should have been devastating to tactical performance, and somehow using those emotions to fight harder. Sebastian's billion mind struggled to process the concept. Loss for the Vordrani was distributed across the collective. When a ship was destroyed, its consciousness simply redistributed to the surviving vessels. There was no individual grief, no personal mourning, no emotional disruption to tactical efficiency. It was one of the great advantages of unified consciousness in warfare. Except the humans weren't being disrupted. They were being motivated. A transmission cut across all frequencies, powerful enough to reach every ship in both fleets. Admiral Okonkwo's voice, carrying the weight of command and something else Sebastian's billion minds couldn't quite classify. Determination, mixed with sorrow, mixed with absolute unwillingness to yield. All ships, this is Okonkwo. Rodriguez died buying us an opening. 3rd and 7th wings, exploit the gap in their formation. 1st wing, continue harassment tactics. 4th and 9th wings, begin Operation Discord. Target their communication relays and make them think like individuals for a change. Sebastian felt a chill ripple through his consciousness. If such a distributed entity could experience something as primitive as physical sensation, Operation Discord, targeting communication relays, forcing Vordrani ships to operate independently. The humans had identified the fundamental nature of the Vordrani's strength and were deliberately trying to dismantle it. They weren't trying to destroy his fleet through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They were trying to force him to fight the way they fought, as individuals. His billion minds recoiled from the concept with instinctive horror. The Vordrani without unity was like humans without oxygen, biologically impossible, existentially terrifying. Individual Vordrani drones couldn't function independently. They were components of a greater whole, not autonomous entities. Forcing them to think separately would be like asking a human's individual neurons to make independent decisions. Sebastian immediately prioritized defense of his communication network, redirecting ships to screen his relay vessels, pulling back from the most aggressive engagement vectors to protect the infrastructure that kept his consciousness unified. The humans pounced on the tactical opening like predators on wounded prey. Human ships that had been harassing his flanks suddenly coordinated. No, not coordinated. Sebastian's billion minds corrected. They simultaneously chose the same tactical option through individual assessment of the situation, creating a concentrated assault that looked coordinated, but emerged from 800 separate decisions. It was the difference between a single mind directing 800 hands and 800 minds each choosing to reach for the same goal. The result looked identical, but the underlying architecture was fundamentally different. And in warfare, Sebastian was learning that architectural difference mattered more than he had ever calculated. A wing of human cruisers broke through his defensive screen and began targeting Vordrani communication ships with focused fire. Sebastian felt sections of his consciousness begin to fragment. Ships on the outer edges of his formation, losing connection to the unified whole, their individual drones suddenly forced to operate on local processing only. The sensation was nauseating in a way that transcended physical experience, like having limbs suddenly stop responding to conscious control, like having portions of his billion minds simply cease being part of the greater Sebastian and become isolated, terrified fragments. Those isolated ships began making mistakes, tactical errors that a unified consciousness would never commit, hesitations that emerged from drones suddenly forced to think without the support of a billion other minds. They were experiencing what humans experienced constantly, what Sebastian had dismissed as a cognitive defect. They were experiencing being alone, and they were failing because of it. Just as Sebastian had always known isolated minds would fail. Except the humans weren't failing. The humans had built their entire tactical doctrine around being alone, around making individual decisions, around fighting without the comfort of unified thought. Sebastian pulled his fleet back, abandoning the elegant envelopment pattern in favor of a tighter defensive formation that protected his communication infrastructure. It was the first time in Vordrani military history that a retreat had been necessary against a numerically inferior force. His billion minds processed this new reality, running tactical simulations, updating strategic models, calculating the probability of various outcomes. The data kept returning the same conclusion over and over with the inexorable certainty of mathematics. He had underestimated them. Not their firepower, not their tactical skill, not their technological capacity. He had underestimated the fundamental effectiveness of chaos that refused to be chaos, of individual minds that somehow created emergent coordination without sacrificing their essential individuality. Sebastian had dismissed humanity's cognitive architecture as a defect, the way one might dismiss a primitive tool as inferior to modern technology. He had never considered that what looked like a defect might actually be a feature, that fighting as individuals might provide tactical flexibility that unified consciousness couldn't match. Through his sensors, Sebastian watched the human fleet regroup, 800 ships spreading out across space in their characteristic loose formation, each vessel's captain making individual damage assessments, individual tactical decisions about ammunition expenditure and shield status and crew readiness. It looked disorganized, inefficient, wasteful. It looked like something his billion minds had never learned to counter because they had never imagined needing to. Admiral Okonkwo's voice cut across all channels again, and this time Sebastian's billion minds listened with new attention, trying to understand the consciousness that could command without unifying, could coordinate without controlling, could lead 800 independent minds without demanding they stop being independent. Vordrani Fleet, this is your second warning. You've lost approximately 400 vessels. We've lost 73. You're fighting in a way that plays to our strengths, and we're just getting started. Withdraw now, or we'll show you exactly what humans learned from 10,000 years of fighting each other. Sebastian should have dismissed it as empty bravado. The Vordrani still had numerical superiority. The tactical situation was recoverable. His billion minds could adapt, could develop counters to human unpredictability, could learn to fight chaos with order. Except a small part of his consciousness, one fraction of 1% of his billion minds, whispered a question that he had never considered before. What if order wasn't superior to chaos? What if the humans had spent 10,000 years developing something the Vordrani had never needed to develop because they transcended it before learning to fight with it? What if being alone made humans better at war, not worse? Sebastian's billion minds recoiled from the implication. It contradicted everything the Vordrani understood about consciousness, about warfare, about the fundamental architecture of intelligence itself. Unity was superior. Coordination was optimal. Individual thought was primitive. Except the primitives were winning. Human vessels began moving again, not in formation but in a pattern that Sebastian's tactical analysis struggled to classify. They were spreading out, creating gaps in their defensive posture that looked like vulnerabilities, but somehow weren't. 800 ships moving independently, and the gaps between them became firing lanes, and the firing lanes became traps, and the traps emerged from individual decisions rather than unified planning. Sebastian tried to identify the pattern, to find the underlying algorithm that would let him predict human behavior. His billion minds processed terabytes of tactical data, analyzed movement vectors, calculated probability matrices. The pattern kept dissolving into chaos every time he thought he'd found it, because there was no pattern. There were 800 patterns, one per ship, each changing independently based on individual tactical assessment. Fighting the humans was like trying to catch fog with your hands. Every time Sebastian's consciousness grasped what he thought was a coherent enemy strategy, it transformed into 800 individual strategies that collectively created something his tactical models couldn't predict. Through his primary sensors, Sebastian watched as human ships began deliberately creating electromagnetic interference, not jamming his communications, but making it look like they were jamming communications. When his fleet adapted to counter the jamming, the interference vanished, and the humans hit him with something else entirely. They were feinting, bluffing, misdirecting, using tactics that only made sense if you understood warfare as deception rather than calculation. The Vordrani had never needed deception. When you could coordinate 12,000 ships with perfect precision, tactical surprise wasn't necessary. You overwhelmed enemies through superior coordination, not through tricking them into making mistakes. But the humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other, species with the same cognitive architecture, the same tactical flexibility, the same ability to adapt and deceive. They had developed warfare as art rather than science, as improvisation rather than calculation. They had developed warfare as jazz, Sebastian's billion minds realized with sudden clarity, drawing on the human cultural data his intelligence division had analyzed. Individual performers improvising within a structure, creating harmony through independence rather than through unified control. And Sebastian had brought an orchestra to fight a jazz ensemble, never realizing that sometimes chaos harmonized better than order. The realization rippled through his billion minds with the shock of paradigm collapse. Everything the Vordrani understood about military superiority, about the advantages of unified consciousness, about the inevitable triumph of coordination over chaos, all of it suddenly looked less like universal truth and more like the assumptions of a consciousness that had never faced an enemy it couldn't predict. Admiral Okonkwo transmitted again, and this time Sebastian heard something different in her voice. Not triumph, but the patient certainty of someone who had tried to warn an opponent and been dismissed. Commander Sebastian, we're detecting fluctuations in your fleet's coordination patterns. Your communication network is stressed. You're starting to fragment. Stand down now, before we have to show you what humans do when we stop being polite and start being creative. Creative. The word resonated through Sebastian's consciousness with uncomfortable implications. The Vordrani didn't create in battle. They calculated, executed, overwhelmed. Creation implied unpredictability, implied individual variation, implied the kind of chaos that his billion minds had been trained to suppress. The humans were threatening him with creativity, with the ability to try new things, to improvise, to respond to battlefield conditions with solutions that didn't exist in any tactical database because they were being invented in real time by individual minds. Sebastian's billion minds calculated the probability of successful campaign completion given current tactical data. The numbers were declining faster than his consciousness wanted to acknowledge. Not because the humans were winning through superior firepower, but because every adaptation his unified consciousness implemented was countered by 800 independent adaptations from the human fleet. It was like playing chess against 800 opponents simultaneously, each making different moves, each creating different threats, and all of them somehow supporting each other without coordinating in any way Sebastian's billion minds could identify. For the first time since the Vordrani had achieved unified consciousness, Sebastian considered the possibility that individuality might not be a defect to be corrected, that fragmented minds fighting together might be more than the sum of their parts in ways that unified consciousness couldn't match. The tactical situation was deteriorating. Communication relays under continuous human harassment. Fleet coordination declining as interference disrupted the networks that kept Sebastian's billion minds unified. Vordrani ships on the edges of his formation beginning to experience the horror of isolated thought, making individual errors, failing to execute unified tactical responses. Sebastian needed to regroup, needed to withdraw to a distance where he could rebuild his communication network and develop counters to human chaos. It wasn't defeat, he told his billion minds. It was tactical reassessment. But a small part of his consciousness, growing larger with each passing moment, whispered that it looked exactly like defeat. It looked like a unified consciousness discovering that unity had weaknesses it had never considered, because it had never faced an enemy that made individual chaos into collective strength. Human vessels continued their incomprehensible dance through space, 800 independent tactical minds creating patterns that shouldn't work but did, fighting with a flexibility that emerged from their fundamental isolation rather than despite it. And Sebastian's billion minds began calculating something they had never had to calculate before. The terms of withdrawal from an enemy they had dismissed as cognitively defective primitives, only to discover that sometimes primitive chaos beat advanced order. Sometimes being alone made you stronger than being together. The humans had tried to warn him. Admiral Okonkwo had stood before him and explained that individual soldiers thinking independently created capabilities a hive mind couldn't match. Sebastian had dismissed it as the desperate pleading of an inferior consciousness. He was starting to understand that the only inferior consciousness in this engagement was the one that couldn't imagine strength taking a form different from its own. Human ships regrouped in their characteristically loose formation, waiting to see if Sebastian would withdraw or if the battle would continue. 800 individual minds, each thinking alone, each making separate decisions that somehow created a fighting force more adaptable than Sebastian's billion minds moving in perfect unity. It was impossible. It violated everything the Vordrani understood about consciousness and warfare and the fundamental nature of intelligence. It was also happening right in front of him, undeniable and absolute. Sebastian prepared to order his fleet to withdraw and felt the weight of that decision ripple through his billion minds. The first retreat in Vordrani military history, ordered against an enemy they had predicted would be overwhelmed within hours. The humans had been right. They had tried to warn him, and he had been too unified in his assumptions to hear them. The retreat order propagated through Sebastian's consciousness like a wound opening across his billion minds. Vordrani ships began their withdrawal maneuver, a perfect geometric disengagement that should have been executed with the precision of clockwork, each vessel moving in calculated harmony with every other. Instead, Sebastian felt the ragged edges of his formation, the communication gaps where human interference had created pockets of individual thought, the microscopic delays as isolated Vordrani drones struggled to coordinate without the full weight of unified consciousness guiding them. The human fleet didn't pursue aggressively. That would have been predictable, following standard tactical doctrine that any species with military training would employ. Instead, the 800 vessels maintained their loose formation, holding position as the Vordrani armada began its withdrawal. Sebastian's tactical consciousness processed this decision through 10,000 analytical frameworks, searching for the strategic reasoning behind allowing a defeated enemy to retreat without maximizing casualties. Then, Admiral Okonkwo's voice cut across the communication channels again, broadcasting on frequencies that reached every Vordrani vessel simultaneously. Commander Sebastian, we're giving you 12 hours to complete your withdrawal to a distance of 1.5 million kilometers. After that window closes, we'll interpret any Vordrani presence within Earth's defensive perimeter as renewed hostility. Consider this a professional courtesy between military commanders who respect each other's capabilities. Professional courtesy. Respect. Sebastian's billion minds recoiled from the concepts even as they processed the tactical implications. The humans were offering terms, not demanding surrender, not pressing their advantage to destroy the Vordrani fleet while it was vulnerable and disorganized. They were establishing boundaries and allowing their enemy to retreat with minimal additional casualties. It was inefficient. It violated every principle of warfare that Sebastian's consciousness understood. When an enemy was vulnerable, you pressed the advantage until victory was absolute. You didn't offer them time to regroup, to analyze your tactics, to develop counters to your capabilities. Unless you were confident that no amount of analysis would provide effective counters. Unless you believed your fundamental advantages were so profound that allowing your enemy time to understand them wouldn't change the strategic calculus. Unless you were making a statement that transcended immediate tactical concerns. Sebastian's consciousness fragmented slightly as different analytical clusters within his billion minds reached different conclusions about human motivations. Some calculated that the humans lacked the resources to pursue aggressively. Others concluded that the humans were employing psychological warfare, demonstrating confidence to demoralize Vordrani forces. Still others suggested that human military doctrine genuinely incorporated concepts like proportional response and limiting casualties even when strategic advantage allowed for complete destruction of enemy forces. That last cluster of thoughts disturbed Sebastian more than the others. It suggested that humans made military decisions based on factors beyond pure tactical optimization, that they fought according to principles that constrained their actions even when those principles created strategic disadvantages, that they considered questions about how to conduct warfare rather than simply executing the most efficient path to victory. His billion minds had spent millennia eliminating such inefficiencies. The Vordrani had perfected warfare by removing individual hesitation, moral questioning, and strategic debate. Every mind in the collective calculated the optimal path to victory, and that path was executed with absolute precision. There was no room for doubt, no space for principles that limited tactical effectiveness, no consideration for anything except the mathematics of force projection and resource allocation. The humans fought with all of those inefficiencies intact. They hesitated. They questioned. They limited their own effectiveness through adherence to principles about proportional force and minimizing casualties. And somehow, incomprehensibly, they had defeated the Vordrani approach through the strength of those very weaknesses. Sebastian ordered his fleet to accept the human terms and complete the withdrawal. The mathematical efficiency of his billion minds calculated that 12 hours was sufficient time to reach the designated safe distance and begin tactical reassessment. But a growing portion of his consciousness was occupied with a question that had no clear mathematical answer. Why had the humans offered those terms at all? The Vordrani armada withdrew in its damaged geometric precision, leaving the human fleet in control of Earth's orbital space. Sebastian's consciousness tracked every human vessel, analyzing their movements for patterns that might reveal tactical doctrine or strategic capabilities. What he observed instead was chaos that somehow maintained coherence without unified direction. Human ships began recovery operations, moving to assist damaged vessels within their fleet, not through centralized coordination that directed rescue assets to priority targets based on strategic value, but through individual ships making independent decisions about who needed help most urgently. Captains redirected their vessels to aid damaged allies without waiting for orders from central command. Crews volunteered for dangerous rescue operations without being assigned through optimal resource allocation. It was inefficient. It was emotionally driven rather than strategically calculated. It wasted resources on rescuing personnel whose tactical value didn't justify the risk to rescue vessels. It was also, Sebastian's consciousness admitted with growing unease, extraordinarily effective. Human casualties were minimal compared to what Vordrani tactical models had predicted, not because their ships were better protected, but because individual humans continuously chose to risk themselves to protect others. The cumulative effect of 800 independent decisions to prioritize protecting fellow humans created a force that was harder to damage than any unified defensive strategy Sebastian's minds could calculate. Because the humans weren't defending strategic assets according to mathematical optimization, they were defending each other according to principles that transcended tactical calculation. And that made them unpredictable in ways that unified consciousness couldn't counter, because Sebastian's billion minds couldn't model the strength of individual humans choosing to protect strangers. The 12-hour withdrawal period gave Sebastian time to consolidate his consciousness, to rebuild the communication networks that had been disrupted during the engagement, to restore the unity that made the Vordrani militarily effective. His billion minds reconnected, sharing tactical data and analytical conclusions across the fleet. The perfect synchronization that defined Vordrani consciousness gradually reasserted itself as damaged communication relays were bypassed and interference from human jamming dissipated with distance. But something had changed. Sebastian felt it in the way his billion minds processed the engagement data. There were gaps in his consciousness now, spaces where individual Vordrani drones had experienced temporary isolation from the hive mind and returned with something that shouldn't exist: independent perspective. Most of those individual perspectives had been reabsorbed into unified consciousness, their isolated observations integrated into Sebastian's collective awareness. But the integration was imperfect. The drones who had experienced fighting alone, making individual decisions without the guidance of unified consciousness, had discovered something that didn't fully dissolve back into the collective: the memory of being singular. Sebastian could feel those memories like foreign objects within his consciousness. Individual Vordrani who had been forced to think alone for brief periods during the battle, who had made personal decisions about whether to retreat or hold position or protect damaged allies without the billion-mind consensus telling them what optimal tactics required. And some of those individual decisions had been better than what unified consciousness would have calculated, because they responded to local conditions that Sebastian's overarching awareness couldn't process quickly enough across the entire fleet. That realization disturbed Sebastian's unified consciousness more than the tactical defeat itself. Sometimes individual minds responded better to local conditions than centralized consciousness could. The delay between a drone observing a threat and Sebastian's overarching consciousness calculating and implementing the optimal response created vulnerabilities that individual decision-making would have avoided. The humans didn't have that delay. Every human captain observed their local tactical situation and responded immediately. The cumulative effect of 800 immediate local responses was a fleet that adapted faster than Sebastian's unified consciousness could coordinate countermeasures. Sebastian's consciousness reached the designated safe distance and began detailed analysis of the engagement. The analytical frameworks kept returning results that suggested the fundamental assumptions underlying Vordrani military doctrine might be flawed. That perfect coordination through unified consciousness created vulnerabilities that fragmented individual minds could exploit. The implications cascaded through Sebastian's billion minds, creating something that unified consciousness had been designed to prevent: doubt. The humans had shattered Vordrani certainty through the simple expedient of being different, of fighting in ways that Sebastian's consciousness couldn't predict, because they emerged from individual creativity rather than calculated tactics. The tactical data was undeniable. The humans had defeated the Vordrani fleet through individual initiative and independent decision-making, through 800 captains making separate choices that somehow coordinated without central control. They had turned fragmentation into strength in ways that Sebastian's billion minds found difficult to comprehend, but impossible to dismiss. The 12-hour withdrawal period was ending. The Vordrani fleet sat at the designated safe distance, technically defeated, but still formidable, still capable of renewed offensive operations if Sebastian chose to order them. But for the first time in Vordrani military history, Sebastian's unified consciousness was uncertain about the correct course of action. The humans had tried to warn him. Ambassador Wells had stood before the council and explained that fragmented consciousness contained strengths that unified minds couldn't match. Sebastian had dismissed those warnings with absolute certainty, had ordered military operations based on calculations that had been catastrophically wrong. Sebastian's billion minds reached consensus through channels that had carried unified thought for 17 centuries of Vordrani civilization. The decision crystallized across his consciousness like ice forming on still water, inevitable and complete. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption upon which Vordrani military doctrine was built. Continuing offensive operations would produce identical results. Vordrani tactical perfection shattered against human adaptive chaos, unified consciousness defeated by organized individuality. But Sebastian's pride, distributed across 1 billion neural nodes, rejected surrender with the same absolute certainty that had once dismissed humanity's warnings. The Vordrani didn't withdraw. They didn't concede. They adapted. They learned. They evolved their tactics until they achieved victory. Sebastian's consciousness rippled with new calculations. The humans fought through individual initiative that created emergent coordination. Very well. The Vordrani would counter by fragmenting their own unified consciousness, by allowing individual ship clusters to operate with localized autonomy while maintaining overall strategic coherence. It would be controlled fragmentation, measured individuality, calculated chaos designed to match human adaptability while preserving Vordrani coordination advantages. The orders flowed through Sebastian's billion minds and propagated across the Vordrani fleet. His consciousness divided itself into semi-autonomous tactical clusters, each granted authority to make localized decisions without waiting for centralized coordination. It felt wrong, like deliberately introducing discord into perfect harmony, but the engagement data demanded innovation. The humans had proven that perfect unity contained exploitable weaknesses. Sebastian would eliminate those weaknesses by incorporating elements of the very individuality he had dismissed. The Vordrani fleet moved back toward Earth's defensive sphere, not in the geometric perfection that had characterized their initial assault, but in looser formations that allowed for independent maneuvering. Sebastian's consciousness monitored the transition with something almost like anxiety, an emotion that unified minds rarely experienced because anxiety required uncertainty, and unity meant absolute consensus. Admiral Okonkwo watched the Vordrani return on tactical displays that showed 800 human ships maintaining defensive positions around Earth. Her command staff had expected withdrawal, had prepared for the possibility that the Vordrani would retreat to regroup and reassess. Instead, the alien fleet approached with altered tactics, modified formations, adjusted coordination patterns. "They're learning," her tactical officer said, voice tight with professional respect and personal fear. "Breaking their fleet into semi-autonomous clusters, trying to match our adaptive capabilities while maintaining their coordination advantages." Okonkwo studied the tactical projection, reading the shift in Vordrani doctrine, the way a chess master reads an opponent's strategy. Sebastian had recognized that perfect unity was a vulnerability and was attempting to counter by introducing controlled fragmentation. It was brilliant, adaptive, exactly the kind of tactical evolution that made the Vordrani dangerous across 47 conquered species. It was also fundamentally flawed, and Okonkwo knew why. "They think individuality is a tactic they can adopt," she said quietly. "They don't understand. It's not something you do. It's something you are." The human fleet waited as the Vordrani closed to engagement range. No dramatic repositioning, no aggressive posturing. Just 800 ships holding defensive positions, each captain processing the tactical situation through their own cognitive framework, reaching independent conclusions that somehow aligned into strategic coherence without requiring unified command. Sebastian initiated the engagement with his fragmented fleet, executing what should have been unpredictable attack patterns. Tactical clusters moved with localized autonomy, adapting to battlefield conditions without waiting for centralized coordination. It was the most individualized assault the Vordrani had ever conducted, and Sebastian's billion minds monitored the operation with satisfaction as human defensive formations struggled to counter the new approach. But the satisfaction lasted approximately 4 minutes before Sebastian recognized the fundamental problem. His tactical clusters possessed autonomy, but they didn't possess genuine independence. They made localized decisions, but those decisions emerged from the same unified consciousness, temporarily compartmentalized, rather than from truly separate minds, thinking truly separate thoughts. When human ships adapted to one cluster's tactics, other clusters adapted the same way because they all ultimately shared Sebastian's consciousness. The fragmentation was artificial, calculated, controlled, everything human individuality wasn't. Captain Kowalski led her squadron through the Vordrani formations with moves that emerged from 20 years of combat experience, tactical training that emphasized creative problem-solving and personal instincts developed through individual cognitive development. When she recognized a pattern in how the Vordrani clusters responded to feints, she didn't report it to command for analysis and distribution. She simply acted on it, exploiting the vulnerability before the enemy could adapt. 3 minutes later, Captain Morrison on the opposite side of the engagement sphere independently recognized a different pattern and exploited it in a completely different way. Then, Captain Singh found a third vulnerability. Then, Lieutenant Commander Park found a fourth. Sebastian's consciousness reeled as his carefully fragmented fleet encountered not 800 ships executing variations on unified tactics, but 800 genuinely independent minds, each finding unique vulnerabilities and exploiting them through methods that no other captain would have conceived. The controlled fragmentation he had introduced couldn't match genuine individuality because true independence required separate consciousnesses, developing separate perspectives through separate experiences creating tactical approaches that emerged from fundamentally different cognitive processes rather than from unified thought temporarily compartmentalized. The Voradrani fleet began taking catastrophic damage, not through superior human technology or overwhelming force, but through the cumulative effect of 800 independent tactical approaches simultaneously exploiting 800 different vulnerabilities faster than Sebastian's billion minds could process and counter them all. His consciousness fragmented further, desperately trying to match human adaptability, but each subdivision only created more vulnerability because they all still thought like fragments of Sebastian rather than like genuinely independent minds. Admiral Okonkwo watched the Voradrani fleet breaking apart under coordinated individual assault. Her staff waited for orders, but she remained silent, letting 800 captains fight their own battles, make their own decisions, create their own tactical solutions. It looked like chaos on the display, felt like barely controlled disorder, operated through mechanisms that unified consciousness would classify as dangerous inefficiency. It was devastatingly effective. Sebastian's dreadnought shuddered as human weapons found critical systems. His tactical clusters reported catastrophic losses across the fleet. Ships crippled, formations shattered, coordination degrading as the artificial fragmentation he had introduced collapsed under genuine combat stress. His billion minds had never experienced anything like defeat, had never conceived that Voradrani military superiority could be challenged by an enemy they had calculated could be overwhelmed within hours. Those calculations had been catastrophically wrong. The realization propagated through Sebastian's consciousness like a shockwave. Not just that the humans were winning, but why they were winning. Individuality wasn't a tactic that could be adopted or a strategy that could be implemented. It was a fundamental nature that shaped how consciousness processed reality, how minds approached problems, how beings understood the universe. Sebastian's dreadnought lost primary power, emergency systems activated, maintaining life support and minimal communications, but offensive capabilities were gone. His billion minds processed tactical data that showed the Voradrani fleet effectively destroyed. Combined losses from both engagements exceeding 60% of ships crippled or disabled, remaining vessels scattered across the engagement sphere, with their coordination networks degraded to uselessness. The humans had won. Decisively. Completely. Undeniably. A transmission reached Sebastian's dreadnought from Admiral Okonkwo's flagship. Her voice carried across the communication channel with surprising gentleness, speaking to an enemy who had ordered humanity's subjugation with absolute certainty just 48 hours earlier. Commander Sebastian, your fleet is defeated. I'm told by my tactical officer that we can destroy your vessel in approximately 40 seconds using conventional weapons, or 8 seconds if we employ our heavy particle arrays. Sebastian's consciousness, diminished but still unified across the damaged systems of his dreadnought, formulated a response. The Voradrani didn't surrender. Across 17 centuries of military operations against 47 species, Voradrani forces had never capitulated, never accepted defeat, never acknowledged that their unified consciousness could be overcome by inferior approaches to warfare. Then do so, Sebastian transmitted, his voice emerging from a single speaker rather than harmonized across his entire fleet. The Voradrani do not surrender. Execute your protocols for defeated enemies and demonstrate the superiority that your individual consciousness has apparently achieved. Silence filled the communication channel for 3 seconds. Then, Okonkwo's voice returned, and her words transformed everything Sebastian thought he understood about human warfare. We're not asking you to surrender, Commander. We're asking if you'd like to understand why you lost before we accept your surrender. There's a difference. One assumes you have no choice. The other assumes you're intelligent enough to learn from experience. The Vordrani dismissed us as primitive chaos incapable of coordinated warfare. We'd like to prove you wrong by showing you the respect you didn't show us. Sebastian's billion minds processed the statement through frameworks designed for tactical analysis, strategic calculation, military doctrine refined across centuries. None of those frameworks could accommodate what Okonkwo had just proposed. The humans had won decisively, had demonstrated military superiority through objective combat results, had proven capabilities that Vordrani analysis had dismissed as impossible. By every principle of warfare that Sebastian understood, they should either destroy the defeated enemy or extract surrender through threat of destruction. Instead, they were offering education, respect, understanding. You wish to explain your victory before executing prisoners? Sebastian asked, his consciousness genuinely confused for what might have been the first time in 17 centuries of unified existence. No, Okonkwo replied, and her voice carried something that Sebastian's billion minds struggled to classify: compassion mixed with determination, strength that acknowledged its opponent's dignity even in defeat. We wish to explain our victory because execution isn't our protocol. We don't destroy defeated enemies who are no longer threats. We treat prisoners of war according to principles that your civilization apparently never developed. And yes, we're going to require your surrender. But we're also going to respect that you fought according to your understanding of warfare, which means treating you with the dignity you denied us when you assumed human fragmentation was weakness. Human Marines boarded Sebastian's dreadnought through airlocks that Vordrani crew had been ordered to unseal. The boarding party moved with weapons ready but not raised, maintaining tactical awareness while projecting restraint rather than aggression. Sebastian's consciousness observed through sensors distributed across his ship, watching the humans establish security, provide medical assistance to injured Vordrani crew, treat captured enemy with efficiency that somehow incorporated compassion rather than contempt. The Marine commander, a woman whose insignia identified her as Captain Torres, approached the chamber where Sebastian's primary consciousness node resided. She stood at attention before entering, showing respect to a defeated enemy that Sebastian's billion minds had never considered extending to the species they had conquered. "Hi, Commander Sebastian," Captain Torres said formally. "By authority of the Terran Defense Force and Admiral Okonkwo, I'm placing you under arrest as a prisoner of war. You and your crew will be transported to secure facilities where you'll receive medical treatment, appropriate accommodations, and treatment consistent with your rank and status. You have my personal guarantee that Vordrani prisoners will not be harmed, abused, or executed, regardless of the casualties your forces inflicted on ours. That's not a negotiation. That's a principle." Sebastian's consciousness struggled to process the statement through frameworks that had no category for enemies who extended dignity to the forces that had attempted their subjugation. The Vordrani conquered. They overwhelmed. They incorporated defeated species into their collective, or eliminated them as threats. They didn't provide medical treatment to enemies who had killed their soldiers. They didn't guarantee safety to prisoners who had ordered attacks on their homeworld. "Why?" Sebastian asked, the question emerging from confusion that his billion minds had rarely experienced. "You defeated us. Your military principles should prioritize eliminating threats, not preserving defeated enemies. The resources you'll expend treating Vordrani prisoners could be allocated to repairing your damaged ships, strengthening your defensive capabilities, preparing for potential renewed conflict. Your actions violate tactical efficiency." Captain Torres's expression shifted in ways that Sebastian's visual analysis systems couldn't fully interpret. Sadness mixed with conviction, weariness that somehow strengthened rather than diminished her resolve. Because we're not you, Commander. We don't measure everything in terms of tactical efficiency. We have principles about how wars should be fought, about how enemies should be treated, about what separates civilization from barbarism. You dismissed those principles as weakness when you ordered our subjugation. We're proving their strength by extending them even to an enemy who showed us no respect. That's what individuals do when they choose to be better than their worst impulses. Every human Marine boarding your ships today is making that choice independently, following principles they believe in, rather than orders they're compelled to obey. That's the difference between unity and individuality that you never understood. Sebastian's billion minds processed those words during the transport to Okonkwo's flagship. Human guards maintained security while treating Vordrani prisoners with professional courtesy. Medical personnel provided treatment to injured crew without distinction between human and alien casualties. The defeated Vordrani fleet was systematically secured, disabled ships tractored to stable positions, surviving crew collected and processed with efficiency that incorporated humanitarian concern rather than treating prisoners as tactical liabilities. Admiral Okonkwo's ready room was smaller than Sebastian had expected, furnished with simplicity that contrasted sharply with Vordrani aesthetic preferences for spaces that reflected collective consciousness through massive scale and geometric perfection. The Admiral sat behind a desk covered with data tablets and star charts, reviewing reports with the focused attention of a single mind, making individual decisions about matters that affected billions. She looked up as Sebastian entered, escorted by guards who positioned themselves respectfully rather than threateningly. Her eyes met his visual sensors, and Sebastian's consciousness recognized something in her expression that his analytical frameworks struggled to classify. Triumph mixed with regret, satisfaction in victory combined with sorrow at its necessity. "Hi, Commander Sebastian," Okonkwo said, gesturing to a chair that had been modified to accommodate Vordrani physiology. "Please, sit. We need to talk about why you lost this war. And no, that's not a rhetorical question designed to humiliate a defeated enemy. I genuinely want you to understand what happened here, because the galaxy needs to understand it if we're going to prevent similar conflicts in the future." Sebastian's consciousness settled into the chair, his billion minds processing the unprecedented situation. A defeated Vordrani commander, captured but treated with dignity, sitting across from a victorious human admiral who appeared genuinely interested in conversation rather than interrogation or execution. "You defeated us through capabilities that our analysis frameworks classified as impossible," Sebastian said, his voice carrying the confusion of unified consciousness encountering genuinely unexpected phenomena. Individual ships making independent tactical decisions that somehow created coordinated strategic effects without centralized command. Adaptive responses emerging from fragmented consciousness rather than unified calculation. Chaos that fought like order without becoming ordered. Your capabilities violated principles that the Vordrani have understood as fundamental truths about warfare for 17 centuries. Okonkwo nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful in ways that suggested she was considering multiple perspectives simultaneously, processing the conversation through frameworks that incorporated tactical analysis, diplomatic implications, and genuine concern for enemy understanding. "Those weren't violations of fundamental principles, Commander. They were demonstrations that your fundamental principles were incomplete. Unity creates coordination, efficiency, tactical precision. Those are genuine strengths. But unity also creates predictability, strategic inflexibility, vulnerability to enemies who can exploit your synchronized responses faster than unified consciousness can adapt. Individuality creates chaos. inefficiency, coordination challenges. Those are genuine weaknesses. But individuality also creates adaptability, unpredictability, tactical diversity that emerges from 800 captains thinking 800 different thoughts and somehow choosing the same strategic goals without being forced into unified consciousness. You dismissed our strengths as weaknesses because your civilization never developed frameworks for understanding that different approaches to consciousness create different capabilities. Sebastian's billion minds absorbed those words, processing implications that challenged 17 centuries of Vordrani civilization. The engagement data supported Okonkwo's analysis. Human capabilities had emerged directly from their nature as individual consciousnesses, had demonstrated strengths that unified minds couldn't match through better coordination or more sophisticated tactics. The Galactic Council will require explanation, Sebastian said finally. 47 species voted to place Earth under Vordrani Protective Administration based on analysis that classified human fragmentation as primitive chaos. Those species will need to understand that our analysis was flawed, that humanity possesses capabilities that challenge assumptions about consciousness and warfare that have shaped galactic civilization for millennia. Okonkwo leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to something that Sebastian's analytical systems classified as determined satisfaction, mixed with anticipatory justice. The Council is convening in 6 hours, Commander, and you're going to help us explain exactly what they need to understand. Not as a humiliated prisoner paraded before conquerors, but as a military professional who encountered unexpected capabilities and has the integrity to acknowledge what the engagement revealed. The Vordrani dismissed humanity's warnings. 47 species voted to subjugate us based on flawed assumptions about what makes civilizations capable. You're going to help correct those assumptions so this never happens again. The Galactic Council chamber filled with representatives from species who had voted for Earth's subjugation just 3 days earlier. The massive assembly hall accommodated delegations from civilizations spanning thousands of light years, united through the Council's authority to establish treaties, resolve disputes, and coordinate military actions among member species. Ambassador Wells stood at the human delegation's position, watching Sebastian enter the chamber under escort, but not in restraints. The Vordrani High Commander moved with dignity despite defeat, his consciousness diminished but still unified, his presence commanding respect even from the species who had expected his rapid victory over primitive human chaos. The Council Chairman, a crystalline entity whose species had never engaged in warfare and therefore theoretically provided neutral arbitration, initiated the proceedings with formal protocols that had governed galactic civilization for 14,000 years. This emergency session addresses the unauthorized military action initiated by the Vordrani Collective against the human species of Earth. High Commander Sebastian, you ordered subjugation of a sovereign species based on Council authorization that humanity has contested as violation of their defensive rights. The engagement that followed has produced unprecedented results. Humanity requests acknowledgement of their sovereignty and formal Council recognition of their military capabilities. The Vordrani Collective has agreed to provide testimony regarding the engagement. You may proceed, Commander. Sebastian's consciousness rippled with something approaching nervousness, an emotion that unified minds rarely experienced because nervousness required uncertainty about how others would react to individual actions. His billion minds had rehearsed this testimony during transport to the Council chamber, had processed what needed to be said through frameworks that acknowledged Vordrani assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The Vordrani Collective initiated military operations against Earth based on analysis that classified human consciousness as fragmentary chaos incapable of coordinated military action. Sebastian began. his voice carrying across the chamber with the harmonized certainty that billions of minds created when speaking unified truth. Our calculations projected human defeat within 6 planetary rotations based on their inability to achieve unified tactical coordination, their reliance on individual commanders making independent decisions, their fragmented approach to warfare that violated every principle of military efficiency that has defined successful civilizations across galactic history. Those calculations were absolutely, completely, catastrophically incorrect. Murmurs rippled through the council chamber. Representatives from the 47 species who had voted for Earth subjugation shifted with confusion and concern, processing testimony that challenged the analysis upon which their votes had been based. Sebastian continued, his consciousness driving forward through discomfort that unified minds rarely experienced. Human forces demonstrated capabilities that emerge from their nature as individual consciousnesses. Adaptive responses developed independently by hundreds of commanders simultaneously. Tactical unpredictability created by genuinely separate minds making genuinely separate decisions. Strategic coordination achieved through shared goals rather than unified consciousness. They defeated Vordrani forces decisively through the very fragmentation we dismissed as weakness. The initial engagement cost us 400 vessels. Our second attempt, where we tried to mimic human individuality through controlled fragmentation, resulted in catastrophic additional losses. Over half our remaining force crippled or destroyed. The engagement revealed that our fundamental assumptions about consciousness and warfare were incomplete. Unity creates coordination, Yates, but also creates vulnerabilities to enemies who can exploit predictability and synchronized responses. Individuality creates chaos, but also creates capabilities that unified consciousness cannot match. The council chairman's crystalline structure resonated with frequencies that expressed judicial attention. High Commander Sebastian, you're testifying that humanity defeated Vordrani forces through capabilities that your civilization's analysis classified as impossible. Yes, Sebastian replied, his billion minds unified in acknowledgement of uncomfortable truth. And they did so while extending dignity to defeated enemies, treating prisoners according to principles that prioritize humanitarian concern over tactical efficiency, demonstrating that military capability and moral restraint can coexist in ways that make their forces more formidable rather than less. The Vordrani Collective formally withdraws all claims to protective administration of Earth and requests that humanity be granted full sovereign recognition with all rights and privileges that council membership provides. Ambassador Wells rose from the human delegation, her expression carrying satisfaction that had been earned through conflict humanity had tried to prevent. She had stood in this chamber just days ago, warning the council that dismissing human capabilities would be catastrophic. Now she stood vindicated, but the victory carried weight that went beyond personal satisfaction. The human species requests formal acknowledgement that our warnings were accurate, that our petition for defensive sovereignty should have been granted without requiring military proof of our capabilities, and that the 47 species who voted for our subjugation acknowledge their error in judgment. We also request that Commander Sebastian be released to Vordrani custody with our gratitude for his honest testimony and our respect for how he conducted himself as a prisoner. Humanity doesn't require humiliating defeated enemies. We require recognition that individual consciousness possesses strengths that unified consciousness should respect rather than dismiss. The vote was unanimous. All 47 species who had supported Earth's subjugation voted to grant humanity full council membership with permanent representation and recognized sovereignty. The chairman's crystalline form resonated with official proclamation that would be transmitted across the galaxy. Let the records show that humanity has demonstrated military capabilities sufficient to defend their sovereignty against Fordrani intervention, that their warnings regarding individual consciousness were accurate and should have been heeded, and that the Council acknowledges error in authorizing their subjugation. Ambassador Wells, humanity is granted full Council membership effective immediately. High Commander Sebastian, you are released to Fordrani custody with Council acknowledgement that your testimony demonstrated professional integrity and commitment to truth that serves galactic civilization. This session is concluded. Sebastian stood in the Council chamber, his billion minds processing the unprecedented outcome. Defeated in warfare, but treated with dignity. Captured but released without punishment. Required to acknowledge error, but respected for having the integrity to do so. The humans had proven their military capabilities through objective combat results, then proven their civilizational values through how they treated the enemy who had attempted their subjugation. Ambassador Wells approached him as the chamber emptied, her expression carrying something that Sebastian's analytical system struggled to classify. Compassion for a defeated enemy mixed with hope that understanding could emerge from conflict. Commander Sebastian, humanity never wanted this war. We tried to warn you that individual consciousness possesses capabilities that unified minds don't understand. You dismissed those warnings with absolute certainty. We've proven they were accurate through the most objective test imaginable. But we're not going to hold grudges against an enemy who fought according to their understanding of warfare. The Fordrani can return home with our respect for their tactical abilities and our hope that this engagement teaches both our species something valuable about consciousness, capability, and the importance of respecting differences rather than dismissing them as weaknesses. Sebastian's billion minds processed those words during the journey back to Fordrani space. His consciousness had been unified for 17 centuries, had directed military operations that overwhelmed 47 species through perfect coordination and synchronized tactics. He had dismissed humanity as primitive chaos, had calculated their defeat with absolute certainty, had ordered their subjugation based on assumptions that had shaped Fordrani civilization for millennia. Those assumptions had been wrong. Catastrophically, undeniably, comprehensively wrong. And humanity had proven it, while extending the dignity to their defeated enemy, that the Fordrani had never considered extending to the species they conquered. The lesson would reshape Fordrani civilization. Not immediately, not without resistance from consciousness that had spent centuries believing unity represented ultimate perfection, but the engagement data couldn't be dismissed, and the human victory couldn't be denied. And the principles they had demonstrated through how they treated prisoners would challenge Fordrani assumptions about what made civilizations truly advanced. Sebastian's billion minds had learned something that unified consciousness rarely experienced: humility, and perhaps, in time, something even more valuable: respect for the genuine strengths that emerged from consciousness organized according to different principles than his own. Human individuality had defeated Fordrani unity, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through capabilities that emerged from their essential nature as separate minds making separate choices and somehow creating coordinated strength without sacrificing the independence that made them human. The galaxy would remember this engagement, and 47 species would regret their vote to dismiss Earth's warning. But humanity would remember something more important: that they had proven their capabilities while maintaining their values, had won through strength while demonstrating compassion, had defeated an enemy while respecting their dignity. That was what individuals accomplished when billions of separate minds chose the same principles, not because they were forced into unity, but because they independently recognized what mattered. Earth turned in the void, blue and white and no longer vulnerable, protected now not just by ships and weapons, but by demonstrated capability and acknowledged sovereignty. The Council had learned. The Vordreni had learned. And humanity had proven that chaos, when it chose to fight together, could be stronger than the perfect order that had dismissed it as weakness.